Criminal law, the inchoate offenses and derivative liability. First up, attempt. 4 elements: the intent to commit the crime, a substantial step beyond mere preparation, or dangerous proximity. Intent to commit the crime, a substantial step beyond mere preparation, or dangerous proximity. The defendant is dangerously close to completing the last act of the crime. And 4, if complete, what does it do? That is correct. It merges into the target crime. So one can be convicted of attempted murder, but one cannot be convicted of attempted murder and murder. All right, step 1, we have the correct intent to commit the crime. And 2 and 3, substantial step or dangerous proximity. That's correct. Substantial step beyond mere preparation or dangerous proximity, which means, that's right, dangerously close to completing the last act of the crime. And finally, attempt merges into the target crime. All right, let's talk about defenses to attempt. Factual impossibility is not a defense. If you are unsuccessful in completing the target crime, defendant is unsuccessful in completing the target crime. For example, they plan a murder, but the gun misfires, or they simply don't do the crime and say, oh, well, it's impossible because the crime was not committed. That is not a defense. If you attempt the crime, you take a substantial step beyond mere preparation, or you are in dangerous proximity to completing the last act of the crime, firing the gun and missing. You have done an attempt crime and you are guilty of attempt. Let's talk about legal impossibility. Legal impossibility is a defense. Generally, this happens when the defendant believes they are committing a crime, but the act is not, in fact, illegal. So when does this happen? Well, quite a few times when we're talking about white-collar crimes like taxation, or the defendant believes something is fraudulent. The defendant believes that it is, for example, against the law to possess marijuana in Illinois, when in fact it is not. Legal impossibility is a defense. What is legal impossibility? That's right, the defendant believes he is committing a crime, but the act in itself is not criminal, nor is it illegal. Whereas factual impossibility, is that a defense? No, that is no excuse. You have still committed an attempt if you have done what? That's right, taken a substantial step beyond mere preparation or come into dangerous proximity to completing the last act of the crime. Third defense to attempt, abandonment. At common law, abandoning the crime is not a defense to attempt. Under common law, if you walk into a convenience store with a gun intending to commit a robbery, you have the intent to commit a robbery, a substantial step beyond mere preparation, and you're certainly in dangerous proximity. So if for some reason you get scared and leave, your abandonment at common law is not a defense. Why am I emphasizing robbery? Because this was an MBE question. Abandonment of the crime after you have the intent, done that substantial step, or are in dangerous proximity, that is not a defense. Abandonment, not a defense. Guess what? Under the MPC, abandonment is a defense. Same scenario. Abandon would be a defense if the defendant voluntarily and completely abandoned the attempt before the last act. Okay, at common law, you intend to commit it, you take a substantial step where you get in dangerous proximity, you abandon it, you are still guilty of attempt. But if you're in an MPC jurisdiction and you voluntarily and completely abandon the attempt before the crime, abandonment is a defense. Always look in the facts. MPC, abandonment is a defense. Common law, not a defense. Second up, solicitation. Okay, you know what solicitation is. That's right, it's encouraging or commanding or asking someone else to commit a crime. What are the elements? Well, you have to have the intent that somebody else commit the crime. And you have to encourage, command, request, or ask. Solicitation is a crime all by itself. In other words, asking a person to commit a crime completes the crime. However, solicitation does merge into the target crime. So if you ask someone to go in and steal someone else's gold watch and the theft takes place, solicitation merges into the target crime, and then you are guilty of the crime as what? Correct, an accomplice. Defenses to solicitation. Factual impossibility. You're unsuccessful at the solicitation. You ask someone to buy drugs and they say no. Factual impossibility. What is factual impossibility? You're unsuccessful in completing the target crime. So, since solicitation involves asking someone to complete a crime, factual impossibility is a defense if they say, no, I'm not going to do that. Under the MPC, renunciation and withdrawal are a defense to solicitation. So, same scenario, I ask someone to buy drugs and then later I say, no, let's not do that. That's a bad idea. I voluntarily withdraw and I complete some sort of act to thwart the crime. That is a defense under the MPC. Okay, solicitation, encouraging, commanding, requesting another person to commit a crime. Is the crime committed once the solicitation has occurred? Yes. However, solicitation does what? That's right, merges into the target crime. And what are our two defenses? Factual impossibility. And under the MPC, renunciation and withdrawal. Voluntarily and completely renouncing the crime and acting to thwart the crime. Okay, conspiracy. Conspiracy is an agreement. Okay, conspiracy at common law is an agreement between two or more persons to commit a crime. That's right, at common law, it is an agreement between two or more persons to commit a crime. Under the MPC, we have the what theory of conspiracy? That's right, the unilateral theory of conspiracy. Why? That's right, police work. All right, so at common law, we have the agreement between two or more persons, or under the unilateral theory, just one. Two, we have an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy. Okay, so we have the agreement and we have the overt act. Agreement and overt act. Contrast to attempt, intent and substantial step, whereas conspiracy is agreement, and overt act. Okay, this idea of bumping knowledge to purpose. You can be considered part of a conspiracy, defendant, if you know your services are being used to facilitate the conspiracy. I have seen this on the MBE, in which a defendant charges higher prices, for example, for their services because they know it's in furtherance of a conspiracy. That person is guilty of the conspiracy. That is called bumping knowledge to purpose. Defendant knows their services are being used to facilitate a conspiracy, and so they're guilty of conspiracy, guilty of that overt act in furtherance. All right, Wharton's rule, also known as the rule of three. If the crime by its nature requires two persons for its commission, then to be a conspiracy, one other person must be involved in the act. Okay, Wharton's rule, the rule of three, the crime by its nature requires, that's right, two people for its commission. Then to be a conspiracy, that's right, you need three. Pinkerton liability. What is someone's Pinkerton liability? Members of the conspiracy are criminally liable for all of what? That's right, all foreseeable crimes committed in furtherance of the conspiracy. So, bumping knowledge to purpose. Defendant knows his services are being used to facilitate the conspiracy, and he is then guilty of the conspiracy. Wharton's rule, or the rule of three. If the crime by its nature requires two persons for its commission, at least one other person must be involved for the act to be considered a conspiracy. Wharton's rule is the rule of three. If the crime needs two people, you need a third for it to be considered a conspiracy. And your Pinkerton liability, defendant, means that members of the conspiracy are criminally liable for all foreseeable crimes committed in furtherance of the conspiracy. Pinkerton, criminally liable for all foreseeable crimes committed in furtherance of the conspiracy. All right, what about defenses? Okay, at common law, withdrawal is not a defense. Under the MPC, is withdrawal a defense? Yes. How? Same as solicitation. Defendant voluntarily and completely renounces the conspiracy, and they act to thwart the conspiracy. So at common law, there's no withdrawal, but under the MPC, when is a withdrawal a defense? That's right, defendant voluntarily and completely renounces the conspiracy and acts to thwart the conspiracy. Moving on to derivative liability, also known as accomplice liability. An accomplice knowingly, voluntarily, or intentionally assists another in the commission of a crime. And they're criminally liable to what extent? That's right, the same extent as the principal. Voluntarily, knowingly, intentionally gives assistance to another in commission of the crime. And the accomplice is criminally liable to the same extent as the principal. For everything? For all reasonably foreseeable offenses that are the natural and probable consequences of the crime. All right, accomplice liability, 3 elements. Defendant, knowingly, voluntarily, intentionally gives assistance to another in commission of the crime. Okay, say that one. That's element 1. Knowingly, voluntarily, intentionally assists a person in commission of the crime. And how, to what extent is the accomplice liable? Element 2. Element 2, the accomplice is criminally liable to the same extent as the principal. For what? That's right, all foreseeable offenses that are the natural and probable consequences of the crime. Okay, bumping knowledge to purpose works the same way under accomplice liability as it is for conspiracy. If the defendant knows his services are being used to facilitate a crime, he's guilty as an accomplice. So, for conspiracy, if the defendant knows his services are being used to facilitate a conspiracy, they're guilty of conspiracy, the crime of conspiracy. But if the defendant, there's no conspiracy, but the defendant knows his services are being used to help commit a crime, they're guilty as an accomplice. Okay, moving on, an accessory after the fact. Who is that person? A defendant who helps the principal avoid capture or punishment. An accessory after the fact. The defendant helps the principal avoid capture or punishment. Guess what? As an accessory, that person can be convicted separately. Accessory is a separate crime. It is sometimes called obstruction of justice. And finally, let's talk about defenses to accomplice liability. Well, the big one here is if the principal isn't convicted, if the principal criminal is not convicted, can the accomplice then be convicted? No. No, if the principal criminal is found not guilty, the accomplice cannot be found guilty either. Principal's not convicted, accomplice, no accomplice liability. And withdrawal is a defense, but the accomplice must withdraw before what? That's right, the principal completes the crime. And they also must do some act to thwart the crime. So withdrawal is a defense if defendant withdraws before the principal completes the crime and thwarts the crime, or the big one, the principal isn't convicted. There's no accomplice liability if the principal is not convicted. All right, and that's it for accomplice liability and our inchoate offenses.